The year is 2019. The location is the Zero Line near Avdiivka, eastern Ukraine. A cold wind whips through the labyrinth of reinforced earth and timber, carrying the metallic scent of gun oil and wet clay. Walking through the narrow communication trench is not a young infantryman in digital camouflage, but a 95-year-old man in a heavy olive coat. His chest is weighed down by rows of Soviet medals that chime softly against each other with every labored step. This is Professor Igor Malitsky. On his left forearm, faded but legible, is the blue ink that defined his existence for 3 years, 8005. He has traveled hundreds of kilometers from Kharkiv, bypassing the protests of doctors, to stand in the mud once more. He stops, leaning heavily on a cane, his eyes scanning the grey horizon, where artillery shells have churned the earth into a moonscape. He is a survivor of the Auschwitz crematoriums, a man who witnessed the absolute nadir of the 20th century, now standing firm in the trenches of the 21st. But to understand why a man of his age would choose to return to the hell of a front line, we must first understand the precise sequence of wars that forged him the war in eastern Ukraine, known operationally as the Anti-Terrorist Operation, and later the Joint Forces Operation, had by 2019 ossified into a grinding static conflict reminiscent of the very wars history books claimed were obsolete. Stretching over 400 kilometers, the contact line was a jagged wound of trenches, bunkers, and fortified checkpoints cutting through the industrial heartland of the Donbas. It was a war of artillery duels, sniper fire, and drone surveillance where death arrived not in sweeping cavalry charges, but in the sudden thundering arrival of 120mm mortar shells or the silent crack of a high-caliber rifle. For the soldiers dug into the frozen earth near Avdiivka, Pisky, and Marinka, the daily reality was one of mud, cold, and a waiting game that tested psychological endurance as much as tactical skill. Into this frozen theater of attrition stepped Igor Malitsky. At home in Kharkiv, Malitsky was already a living institution. A professor at the Ukrainian Engineering Pedagogics Academy, he was a familiar sight in the city's academic halls. A man of sharp wit, unyielding discipline, and a deep, resonant voice that had lectured thousands of students on machine building and engineering. But he was defined by more than his academic tenure. He was the chairman of the Kharkiv Regional Council of Fighters of the Anti-Fascist Resistance, a title that carried heavy, tangible weight in a region suffocated by the legacy of total war. The optics of his visit were jarring and historically complex. Malitsky wore the uniform of the Soviet era, his chest a heavy wall of medals, including the Order of the Patriotic War. Yet he was visiting troops fighting against forces often flying the very Soviet flags he once served under. This paradox was central to his presence. To Malitsky, the geopolitical nuance was secondary to a singular moral absolute, the defense of one's homeland against invasion. He did not see a contradiction in his attire. He saw a continuity of duty. He viewed the soldiers of the Ukrainian armed forces not as a new entity, but as the spiritual successors to the men he had fought alongside in the 1940s. Young men mobilized to hold a line against an aggressor that sought to erase their national identity. The environment he entered was hostile to human life. The Zero Line was a zone where the infrastructure of civilization had been pulverized. Villages had been reduced to skeletal concrete frames, and the forests, known as Zelekna, were shredded by shrapnel. The soldiers manning these positions were often in their 20s, born decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Equipped with digital radios, Kevlar helmets, and night vision optics. They belonged to a generation raised on the internet. Yet they lived in conditions that a soldier of the Red Army in 1943 would have instantly recognized. The smell of damp wool, the constant digging to improve fortifications, and the reliance on wood-burning stoves to stave off the biting steppe winter. Malitsky's arrival was not merely a morale tour, it was a validation. For the troops, seeing a man who had physically walked out of Mauthausen gave their own struggle a sense of historical gravity. He did not come to offer empty platitudes about glory. He came to inspect the conditions, to see the faces of the new generation, and to compare the nature of their war with the industrial slaughter he had survived. He moved through the rear echelons, past the logistics trucks and the field kitchens, pushing toward the forward operating bases where the risk was genuine. His presence signaled that this modern, often forgotten conflict was part of a longer, darker timeline of European history. The geopolitical situation leading to this moment was fraught with tension. The Minsk agreements were technically in effect, creating a tenuous ceasefire that was violated daily. The world's attention had drifted, but the casualty lists in Kharkiv and Kiev continued to grow. Malitsky, acutely aware of the cost of indifference, refused to remain a passive observer in his comfortable apartment. He understood that war is not a theoretical concept to be studied from a distance, but a physical reality that demands witnessing. But to fully comprehend the weight of his judgment on this modern war, one must look back to the moment his own war began, not in a trench, but in the terrifying suddenness of occupation. To understand the man standing in the Donbas mud, we must rewind the tape of history to 1941. Kharkiv was then a bustling industrial titan of the Soviet Union, a city of factories, universities, and modernist architecture. For a teenager like Igor Malitsky, born in 1925, the war arrived not as a distant rumor, but as a catastrophic, thundering reality. The Wehrmacht's advance into Ukraine was swift and brutal, and Kharkiv became a prize fought over in 4 distinct bloody battles. The city changed hands repeatedly, each exchange grinding the civilian infrastructure into dust and tightening the noose around the population. By early 1943, the occupation had settled into a grim routine of starvation, curfews, and terror. The German administration, ruthlessly efficient, sought to extract every ounce of utility from the conquered territories. Young men and women were prime commodities, targeted for deportation to the Reich to feed the German war machine as slave labor. Malitsky, barely 18, did not keep his head down. Alongside other youths, he engaged in acts of defiance, tearing down occupation posters and disrupting German communication lines. It was a dangerous game played against an enemy that did not recognize the concept of mercy. The inevitable crack of the whip came in 1943. Malitsky was arrested not as a soldier on the battlefield, but as a dissident in occupied territory. The transition from citizen to captive was instantaneous and violent. He was not afforded a trial or a prisoner of war designation. Instead, he was thrust into the labyrinth of the Nazi carceral system. His journey began in a cattle car, a wooden box packed with human bodies, devoid of ventilation, sanitation, or light. The train rattled westward, crossing the borders of a dissolving Europe, carrying its cargo toward the heart of the Third Reich's industrial genocide. This journey was the first stage of dehumanization. The individuals inside ceased to be people with names, histories, or futures. They became units of labor to be expended. When the train finally ground to a halt, the doors were thrown open, not to a labor camp, but to the ramp of Auschwitz-Birkenau. The air was thick with a sweet, cloying stench that the new arrivals could not yet identify. SS doctors stood at the selection point, conducting the flick of the wrist that separated life from immediate death. Malitsky survived this initial cull, stripped of his clothes, his hair, and his name. The needle of the tattooist buzzed into his left forearm, permanently etching the number 8005 into his skin. In that moment, Igor Malitsky ceased to exist in the official records of the world. He was now merely number 8005, a component in a vast machine of extermination. The psychological shock of this transition from the streets of Kharkiv to the electrified wire of Birkenau would break many men in the first weeks. But for Malitsky, it sparked a cold, hard resolve that would carry him through the camps and, 75 years later, propel him toward the front lines of another war. He had entered the abyss, and now we must examine the specific angles of hell he survived to understand the eyes through which he viewed the modern battlefield. To comprehend the man who would later walk the trenches of the Donbas, one must first dissect the specific mechanical horror of his imprisonment. Auschwitz-Birkenau was not merely a prison. It was a sprawling industrial complex dedicated to the production of death. For prisoner 80,000 survival was not a matter of heroism, but of rapid adaptation to a psychotic new ecosystem. The camp operated on a brutal hierarchy. At the bottom were the Muselmänner, prisoners so starved and psychologically broken they had ceased to respond to their surroundings, shuffling toward inevitable death. Above them were the laborers, clinging to life through theft, barter, or the sheer luck of a slightly less lethal work assignment. At the top were the capos, often criminals themselves, tasked with enforcing the SS's will with clubs and whips. Malitsky navigated this minefield with a fierce, burning intelligence. He learned quickly that invisibility was a shield. To be noticed was to be selected. The days were measured in calories and blows. Breakfast was a murky, lukewarm liquid masquerading as coffee. Lunch was a liter of watery soup, often containing rotten vegetables or nothing at all. Dinner was a small brick of sawdust-infused bread. On this starvation diet, Malitsky was forced to perform heavy manual labor, moving earth and stone to expand the very camp that was killing him. The physical transformation was terrifying. The athletic youth from Kharkiv withered into a skeletal frame, his eyes sinking deep into his skull. Yet the spark of defiance remained. But Auschwitz was only the first circle. As the Red Army began its inexorable advance westward in 1944, the Nazis began to liquidate the camps, moving prisoners deeper into the Reich. Malitsky was transferred to Mauthausen in Austria, a camp classified as Stufe 3, or Grade 3. This was the harshest category in the Nazi system, designated for incorrigible political enemies of the Reich. If Auschwitz was a factory of extermination, Mauthausen was a machine of exhaustion. It was known among the SS as the Knochenmühle, the bone mill. Here, the architecture itself was a weapon. The centerpiece of the camp's terror was the stairs of death, 186 steep, uneven granite steps carved into the side of the quarry. Prisoners were forced to carry heavy granite blocks, often weighing up to 50 kilograms, up these stairs while being beaten by guards. One slip meant a domino effect of broken bodies tumbling into the quarry below. Malitsky survived this ascent day after day, his body hardening into something leathery and resilient. He was no longer just surviving. He was enduring with a specific, calculating rage. The most harrowing angle of his confinement came when he was moved to Block 20 within Mauthausen. This was the isolationist block, a prison within a prison, often referred to as the death block. It was a windowless barrack surrounded by its own stone wall, reserved for Soviet officers and prisoners, marked for certain death. Rations here were a quarter of the standard camp allowance. The floor was often slick with filth, and the air was unbreathable. It was here, in the freezing winter of 1945, that the famous Mauthausen breakout occurred. A desperate suicidal uprising where Soviet prisoners, armed with stones and fire extinguishers, charged the machine gun towers. Though the exact details of Malitsky's role in the chaos of the final months are often debated by historians, the reality of his proximity to this event is undisputed. He lived in the shadow of the chimney, breathing the ash of his comrades. He witnessed the absolute limit of human cruelty, the freezing showers in winter, the casual shootings on the Appellplatz, the medical experiments. Yet, crucially, he also witnessed the strength of the collective. He saw men share their last crumbs of bread. He saw the underground resistance networks that sabotaged V-2 rocket parts and passed news of the Allied advance. This duality, the capacity for absolute evil, and the stubborn persistence of solidarity, forged the moral compass he would carry for the next 7 decades. By the time the U.S. 11th Armored Division liberated Mauthausen on May 5, 1945, Malitsky weighed less than 40 kilograms. He was a ghost, but a living one. He emerged from the camp not broken, but calcified. He had seen the worst the world could offer, and he had outlasted it. This survival created a permanent lens through which he viewed all subsequent conflicts. When he looked at a uniform, he didn't just see cloth. He saw the ideology behind it. When he looked at a weapon, he didn't see a tool. He saw the intent to destroy. It was this lens, polished by years of nightmare, that he would bring to the trenches of eastern Ukraine, creating a jarring, almost impossible juxtaposition of eras. Fast forward 75 years, and the lens through which Malitsky viewed the world had not clouded with age. It had sharpened into a piercing moral clarity. The angle that drove him to the Donbas was his controversial, unyielding definition of the enemy. To Malitsky, the war in eastern Ukraine was not a messy, post-Soviet territorial dispute. It was a recurrence of the same plague he had fought in his youth. In interviews and lectures, he frequently drew a direct, jagged line between the Nazi ideology of the 1940s and the aggression he witnessed from the Russian Federation. He coined phrases that made politicians uncomfortable, speaking of Fascism, a portmanteau of Russia and fascism, long before the term entered the common lexicon in 2022. For him, the shelling of Ukrainian cities was not a political maneuver. It was a familiar echo of the Luftwaffe over Kharkiv. This perspective created a powerful, almost electric dynamic when he interacted with the young soldiers of the Ukrainian armed forces. To a 22-year-old infantryman hunkered down in a dugout near Marinka, World War II was ancient history, a chapter in a textbook, a black and white movie. Suddenly, here was a man who had breathed the smoke of the crematoriums, standing in their trench telling them that their fight was the same as his fight. This was not just a morale boost, it was a historical benediction. Malitsky offered them a narrative bridge, connecting their static, muddy war of attrition to the great patriotic war against fascism. He validated their struggle not as a civil conflict, but as a defense of civilization itself against tyranny. There was also a profound tactical angle to his visit, a contrast that Malitsky himself noted with a mixture of grim satisfaction and envy. In Mauthausen, he had been powerless, a starved body subject to the whims of the SS. He had no rifle, no radio, no armor. Resistance was limited to stealing a potato or sabotage that could result in execution. Standing in the modern trench system, surrounded by well-armed troops with anti-tank weapons and secure communications, he saw something he had been denied: the capacity to fight back. He looked at the AK-74s and the RPGs not with fear, but with a fierce appreciation. He told the soldiers, "I envy you. You have weapons in your hands. You can defend your land. We could only die or survive." This realization fundamentally shifted the emotional tone of his presence. He wasn't there to be pitied as a victim of the camps. He was there to encourage them as a fellow warrior who understood the stakes. The soldiers, in turn, treated him with a reverence that transcended rank. He was the ultimate survivor, the man who had beaten the odds that they were currently calculating every day. When he spoke, the chatter of the dugout ceased. He didn't offer strategic advice on flanking maneuvers. He knew his war was different, but he offered the strategic advice of the soul: how to keep one's humanity intact while surrounded by inhumanity. The juxtaposition was stark. The enemy in 1944 wore Hugo Boss uniforms and operated with industrial precision. The enemy across the field in 2019 was often a mix of mercenaries, local separatists, and regular Russian troops, hiding behind the ambiguity of hybrid warfare. But Malitsky cut through the fog. He saw the same intent: the erasure of a people. This moral certainty gave him the energy to ignore his failing health, to wave away the concerns of his doctors, and to demand that he be taken not just to the rear, but to the very edge of the contact line. He needed to look the new enemy in the eye, or at least stare into the grey zone where they waited. The journey to the zero line began in the deceptively calm rear echelon of Kramatorsk. It was a grey morning in late autumn, the sky a heavy slab of slate that threatened snow. Igor Malitsky sat in the passenger seat of a battered military SUV, his small, frail frame almost swallowed by the heavy winter coat and the flak vest he had been gently forced to wear. The vest was a modern ceramic plate carrier, weighing nearly 10 kilograms, a crushing burden for a 95-year-old spine curved by age and the memory of Mauthausen's granite blocks. Yet he refused to take it off. He adjusted the straps with trembling hands, his face set in a mask of concentration. As the convoy moved south, the landscape began to shed the trappings of civilization. The paved roads gave way to churned mud tracks, the asphalt chewed up by the treads of T-64 tanks and heavy logistics trucks. The scenery grew increasingly skeletal. They passed villages that were little more than geographical markers of destruction, roofless houses staring blankly at the road, bus stops riddled with shrapnel holes like Swiss cheese, and the omnipresent signs, "Stop, mines." The trees lining the road, once a windbreak for peaceful farmland, were now splintered stumps, stripped of branch by years of mortar fire. Inside the vehicle, the mood was tense. The soldiers escorting Malitsky were visibly anxious. They were responsible for the safety of a national treasure, a man who belonged in a museum or a university lecture hall, not in the kill zone of a 122mm howitzer. The radio crackled with clipped coded chatter, warnings of drone activity, reports of sniper fire in the sector they were approaching. Every pothole that jarred the suspension sent a wince of pain across Malitsky's face, but he waved away any offers to turn back. He stared out the window, his eyes tracking the scars on the land, reading the battlefield with an intuition dormant since 1945. They reached the second-to-last checkpoint, a fortified maze of concrete blocks and sandbags. Here, the reality of the war shifted from passive to active. The thud of artillery, previously a distant rumble, was now a sharp, percussive crack that vibrated in the chest. The soldiers at the checkpoint, faces smeared with grime and fatigue, stiffened as they recognized the passenger. They saw the pilotka cap, the rows of medals, and the impossible age of the man climbing out of the truck. There was a surreal moment of silence amidst the noise of war, as the young captain on duty saluted. Not a formal parade ground salute, but a sharp, respectful gesture from one combatant to another. Malitsky insisted on walking the final leg. The entrance to the forward trench system was a muddy slope leading down into the earth. The ground was treacherous, a slurry of freezing clay and ice. Supported by two burly infantrymen, Malitsky descended. His breathing was heavy, a ragged wheeze that worried the medics trailing behind, but his legs kept moving. He was entering the arteries of the defense. The walls of the trench rose above his head, reinforced with timber logs and ammunition crates. The air here was different, smelling of damp earth, unwashed bodies, and the distinct metallic tang of fear and readiness. As he shuffled deeper into the labyrinth, the soldiers manning the firing steps turned in disbelief. They were boys, mostly, 19, 20 years old, clutching their rifles, shivering in the damp cold. They watched as this spectre from the great patriotic war materialized out of the mist. Malitsky didn't stop. He pushed past the support lines, past the sleeping quarters, driving relentlessly toward the forward observation post. He wanted to see the enemy positions. He wanted to look across the killing field. The tension in the trench was palpable. A sniper round could snap through the parapet at any second. But Malitsky moved with the fatalistic calm of a man who had already died once in 1943 and was living on borrowed time. He reached the dugout, the 0 point, where the sandbags were piled high and the periscopes peeked over the rim of the world. The dugout was a cramped, subterranean world, lit by the harsh glow of battery-powered LED strips and the flickering light of a potbelly stove. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, gun oil, and cheap tobacco. Malitsky, his chest heaving from the exertion of the walk, was helped onto a makeshift bench made of ammunition crates. He didn't collapse. He sat, with the rigid posture of a man who had been drilled to stand straight before SS officers, regardless of exhaustion. The soldiers crowded around him, their movements careful and reverent in the confined space. These were hardened men, drone operators, machine gunners, medics, but in the presence of prisoner 8005, they seemed to shrink back into boys. One soldier, a bearded sergeant with grime under his fingernails, poured steaming tea into a tin mug and placed it in Malitsky's shaking hands. The metal cup clinked against the medals on his chest, a tiny sound that cut through the silence. Malitsky took a sip, the warmth spreading through him, and then he looked up, his eyes clouded by cataracts, but still burning with a fierce intelligence, locked onto the young faces surrounding him. He didn't launch into a prepared speech. He simply asked, "Show me what you fight with." The sergeant hesitated, then unslung his modified AK-74, equipped with a red dot sight and a suppressor. Malitsky ran his gnarled fingers over the cold polymer and steel. He tested the weight, his hands remembering the few times he had held a PPSH-41 after the liberation. "Good," he rasped, his voice cutting through the damp air. "We had nothing. We had stones. We had wooden clogs. You have this. You can bite back." The atmosphere in the dugout shifted. The tension of the VIP visit evaporated, replaced by a raw electrical connection between generations. Malitsky rolled up the sleeve of his heavy coat. exposing the faded blue ink on his forearm. 8005. He held it out, not as a scar to be pitied, but as credentials to be verified. They tried to turn me into ash, he said, his voice dropping to a growl. They burned millions. But I am here, and because I am here, you are here. He pointed a trembling finger toward the earthen ceiling, toward the grey zone above them. That enemy out there, they want the same thing. They want to erase us. They call it a different name. They wear different patches, but the hunger is the same. I defeated the brown plague. You must defeat this one. It was the decisive moment of the visit. The abstraction of defending the motherland crystallized into something tangible. The soldiers weren't just holding a trench in Donbas. They were holding the line that Malitsky had survived. A young private, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face, reached out and took Malitsky's hand. It was a grip that bridged 75 years, from the electrified fences of 1944 to the artillery craters of 2019. In that handshake, a transfer of power occurred. The burden of survival was passed from the old man to the young warriors. Malitsky stood up, refusing the cane for a moment. He looked at them one last time, his gaze intense. "Do not let them into our home," he commanded. "Not as a professor, but as a senior officer of the resistance. I am too old to hold a rifle. You are my rifle now." As he turned to leave, the adrenaline that had sustained him began to crash. The climb back up the muddy slope would be a torture. Every step a battle against his own failing heart. But he didn't look back. He had delivered his message. He had inspected the guard. And he knew, with a grim final certainty, that the line would hold. The immediate tactical situation in the Donbas did not shift the moment Igor Malitsky's convoy rolled back toward Kharkiv. The mortars continued to fall on Avdiivka. The snipers remained in their hides. But in the information space, a battlefield arguably as critical as the physical trenches, the impact of his visit was seismic. Within hours, the images of the 95-year-old Auschwitz survivor in a flak jacket began to circulate. They cut through the noise of the news cycle with the sharpness of a scalpel. For years, the Kremlin's propaganda machine had relied on a singular, monolithic narrative: that the Ukrainian government and its defenders were neo-Nazis, and that Russia was the sole inheritor of the anti-fascist legacy. Malitsky's presence on the zero line shattered this narrative simply by existing. Here was a man who bore the literal mark of the Holocaust on his skin, a man who had lost his youth to the Third Reich, standing shoulder to shoulder with Ukrainian soldiers. He was not a prop. He was a judge. His endorsement of the Ukrainian defense was a moral absolute that no amount of televised spin could dismantle. When Russian state media attempted to ignore or discredit him, they found themselves in the impossible position of attacking a celebrated Soviet veteran. The psychological effect on the soldiers of the 92nd Mechanized Brigade and other units in the sector was profound. In the days following his departure, the story of the professor became a touchstone. Commanders reported a palpable shift in resolve. The war in the trenches often felt isolating, a forgotten conflict on the edge of Europe. Malitsky had reminded them that they were watched, that their struggle had historical continuity. He had told them, "You are the shield of Europe, just as we were." This reframed their daily misery, the mud, the cold, the fear, into a necessary burden of history. Back in Kharkiv, Malitsky did not retreat into a quiet retirement. The visit to the front seemed to ignite a final reserve of energy. He became a vocal, almost ferocious critic of the aggression, using his unique status to speak truths that politicians could not. He appeared on talk shows and in university lecture halls, his voice rasping but clear. He frequently employed the term Rashism, a fusion of Russia and fascism, drawing uncomfortable, detailed parallels between the early days of Hitler's expansionism and the current annexation of Crimea and Donbas. He spoke of the slicing tactics, the weaponization of language, and the dehumanization of the enemy. "I have seen this before," he warned in one televised interview, shaking a finger at the camera. "I smelled it in 1941. The indifference of the world is the same. The excuses of the aggressor are the same." He was writing the final chapter of his life not as a victim, but as a warning siren. He received hate mail, threats, and accusations of betrayal from across the border, but the man who had survived the death block of Mauthausen was immune to intimidation. He treated the vitriol with the same contempt he had once reserved for the SS guards, as the noise of a morally bankrupt enemy. As 2020 bled into 2021, Malitsky's health began to fail. The years of starvation and torture in his youth had left permanent scars on his internal organs, and age was finally claiming what the Nazis could not. Yet, even from his hospital bed, he remained engaged. He followed the reports from the front lines, checking the casualty lists, mourning every young life lost, as if it were one of his own students. He knew, with the intuition of a survivor, that the static war in the Donbas was not the end, but the prelude. The storm was gathering, and he was racing against time to make sure his warning was heard. The timing of Igor Malitsky's departure possessed a grim, almost merciful precision. He passed away on the night of November 23, 2021, at the age of 96. His heart, which had beaten through the selections of Birkenau, the stone stairs of Mauthausen, and the grey zones of the Donbas, finally came to a rest. His funeral in Kharkiv was a solemn affair, attended by students, veterans, and the soldiers he had visited. He was laid to rest with full military honors, the rifle volley echoing over a city that was still, for a few more weeks, at peace. But the silence did not last. Less than 3 months after his death, on the morning of February 24th, 2022, the nightmare he had spent his final years warning against tore open the sky. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, and Kharkiv, the city Malitsky had rebuilt, taught in and loved, became a primary target. Russian artillery and cruise missiles began to systematically dismantle the streets he had walked for 70 years. The bitter irony of history was on full display. The very forces claiming to fight denazification began shelling the home of a man who had actually defeated the Nazis. In March 2022, a Russian shell struck the Menorah monument at WWII Yar, a Holocaust memorial on the outskirts of Kharkiv, where thousands of Jews were murdered in 1941. It was a symbolic desecration that Malitsky had feared. The erasure of memory by the brute force of high explosives. The university where he had lectured was damaged. The squares where he had rallied against fascism were cratered. Yet, in this catastrophe, Malitsky's spirit did not vanish. It amplified. The image of the old professor in the trench became a viral icon of resistance during the desperate defense of Kharkiv. Soldiers who had met him in the dugouts of Avdiivka were now commanding platoons in the suburbs of Saltivka. They carried his words like ammunition. When the Russian columns were stopped cold at the city limits, burnt out by javelins and NLAWs, it was a victory that belonged to the generation Malitsky had blessed. He had been spared the sight of the burning city, but the city survived because of the resolve he had helped to forge. War is often described as a circle, a loop of history that humanity is doomed to repeat. But for Igor Malitsky, it was not a circle. It was a straight line. A line that began with the scream of a Stuka dive bomber in 1941 and ended with the thud of a 120mm mortar in 2021. He walked that line for 96 years, refusing to step off, refusing to look away. His life forces us to confront a comfortable lie. The idea that the never again promised in 1945 was a guarantee. Malitsky knew better. He knew that never again was not a fact, but a daily command, a frantic, exhausting effort that must be renewed by every generation. He did not go to the trenches of the Donbas to relieve his past. He went to ensure there would be a future. He saw the same hunger in the eyes of the modern aggressor that he had seen in the eyes of the SS, and he recognized that the uniform changes, but the tyranny remains constant. In the end, Professor Malitsky left behind more than a legacy of survival. He left a manual for resistance. He showed that the human spirit can be crushed, starved, and burned, yet still retain the capacity to stand in the mud and say no. The number 18,000 has faded from the earth along with the man who bore it, but the lesson etched into that skin remains. The war against darkness is never truly won. It is only held at bay by those willing to stand on the zero line.